In the generations that followed the great flood described in the book of Genesis, humanity began again with a single family. The sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the ancestors of all the nations that would eventually spread across the earth. The world was young once more, cleansed by the waters that had covered the land during the great catastrophe, remembered as the Great Flood, biblical. Families multiplied, children were born, and tribes slowly expanded outward. At this early stage of human civilization, there was something remarkable about the way people communicated. The entire world spoke one language and shared the same words. There were no barriers of speech, no misunderstandings caused by different tongues. Every instruction, every plan, and every idea flowed freely between people. This unity created a powerful sense of collective purpose. Human beings, newly restored to the earth, possessed not only the memory of survival, but also the ambition to shape their destiny. As their numbers grew, groups began migrating in search of fertile land and opportunity. Their journey eventually led them eastward, until they discovered a wide and fertile plain in the land known as Shinar. It was there, on that vast and open landscape, that humanity would begin one of the most audacious projects recorded in the early chapters of Scripture. The plain of Shinar offered everything a growing civilization could desire. The land stretched out broadly under the open sky, fertile and inviting, with rivers and resources that allowed communities to settle and prosper. The people who arrived there did not intend merely to survive, they intended to build. This moment marked one of the earliest examples of organized human innovation. In ancient times, most construction relied on stones gathered from the earth, but the inhabitants of this region faced a challenge. Stones were scarce in the flat lands of Shinar. Instead of seeing this limitation as an obstacle, they devised a solution that demonstrated both ingenuity and determination. They began producing bricks by shaping clay and baking it in fire until it hardened. For mortar, they used bitumen, a sticky substance found naturally in the region that could bind bricks together with surprising strength. This technological breakthrough allowed them to create structures far more ambitious than anything previously attempted. Communities worked side by side, laboring together with shared enthusiasm. The people encouraged one another, saying, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." Their words reflected not only cooperation, but also a growing confidence in human capability. For the first time in history, humanity began to see that collective effort could reshape the world around them. Yet within that growing confidence lay the seeds of something far more dangerous, an ambition that would soon challenge the boundaries set by God himself. As the settlement expanded across the plains of Shinar, the people began to imagine a project unlike anything humanity had ever attempted. Their growing population and technological progress gave them a sense of unstoppable momentum. They had unity, resources, and a common language that allowed them to coordinate every effort with remarkable precision. Within this environment of cooperation, a bold idea emerged among the leaders and builders of the community. They proposed constructing a city, an organized center of civilization that would stand as a symbol of human achievement. But the city itself was only part of their vision. At its heart, they planned to erect an enormous tower, one so tall that its top would reach toward the heavens. This was not simply an architectural challenge, it was a statement about human ambition. The people declared their intention openly. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens." Beneath those words was a deeper motivation. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They feared being scattered across the earth, and they believed that such a monumental structure would unite them forever. By concentrating their power and identity in one place, they hoped to secure their legacy. What began as cooperation was gradually transforming into collective pride, a belief that humanity working together could elevate itself to a place that rivaled the divine. The construction of the tower began with extraordinary determination. Day after day, workers molded bricks from clay, carried them to the growing structure, and placed them carefully into position. The sound of labor echoed across the plains, tools striking brick, voices calling instructions, fires burning in kilns that baked thousands upon thousands of building blocks. The tower slowly climbed higher into the sky. Each new layer reinforced the people's confidence that their vision was achievable. The city surrounding the tower also began to flourish. Streets formed between rows of structures, homes were built, and markets began to appear. Civilization was taking shape before their eyes, and the tower stood at its center like a monument to human unity and ambition. But the significance of the tower went beyond engineering. In ancient cultures, towers often symbolized a connection between Earth and the divine realm. By raising this structure higher and higher, the builders were not simply creating a landmark, they were attempting to bridge the gap between humanity and heaven. Their goal reflected more than architectural curiosity. It revealed a spiritual defiance. Instead of honoring the authority of God, they were attempting to elevate themselves through their own effort. The tower represented a declaration that humanity would determine its own destiny. With every brick laid into place, the people moved further away from humility and closer toward a dangerous form of pride. According to the narrative preserved in the book of Genesis, the growing tower did not escape the attention of heaven. The scripture describes a moment in which the Lord came down to observe the city and the tower that humanity was building. This description is not meant to suggest that God was unaware of human activity. Rather, it emphasizes the significance of the event. What humanity saw as an extraordinary accomplishment was, from the divine perspective, a development that required intervention. The people had united in language, purpose, and ambition. Their cooperation made their plans extraordinarily powerful. God observed that if humanity continued in this unified state with the same determination, nothing they proposed would be impossible for them. This observation highlighted the immense potential of human collaboration. Yet it also revealed the danger of that power when it was driven by pride and self-exaltation rather than humility and obedience. The builders believed they were creating security and fame, but in reality, they were constructing a symbol of rebellion against the divine order. The tower stood as evidence that humanity had begun to trust its own strength more than the authority of God. It was at this moment that the narrative reaches a turning point. The project that seemed unstoppable was about to encounter a force far beyond human control. In response to the growing arrogance of humanity, God declared a plan that would alter the course of human history forever. Instead of destroying the builders as had happened generations earlier during the Great Flood biblical, God chose a different form of intervention. He said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech." The unity that had empowered humanity would become the very point of its collapse. Until that moment, communication had been effortless. A command spoken by one worker could be understood instantly by another. Plans were coordinated smoothly, and every task moved forward with precision. But once God introduced confusion into their language, that harmony vanished. Suddenly, words that once carried clear meaning became incomprehensible sounds. Instructions were misunderstood, cooperation broke down, and the carefully organized system of construction began to unravel. Workers who had collaborated for months could no longer communicate effectively. Frustration replaced unity, and suspicion began to spread among groups who could no longer understand each other. The confusion was not merely inconvenient, it made the continuation of the tower impossible. What human pride had attempted to build through unity was dismantled through the sudden fragmentation of language. In a single decisive act, God transformed humanity's greatest strength into its greatest limitation. The moment the confusion of language spread among the builders, the once coordinated construction site, descended into chaos. Workers who had previously collaborated with ease suddenly found themselves unable to understand the most basic instructions. A foreman might shout for bricks, but the laborers stared back in confusion. Builders tried to explain measurements and placements, yet their words no longer carried shared meaning. The very tool that had unified humanity, language, had fractured overnight. What had once been a harmonious collaboration became a scene of misunderstanding and frustration. Some groups began to develop their own patterns of speech, unintentionally forming the earliest divisions of language among humanity. People instinctively gravitated toward those whose words they could still understand, creating smaller clusters within the once unified population. The tower itself stood unfinished, its rising walls abruptly abandoned as cooperation became impossible. The confusion spread throughout the entire settlement in the land of Shinar. The grand vision that had once inspired the builders was now overshadowed by the practical reality that they could no longer work together. Communication failures halted every stage of the project: design, coordination, and labor. What had taken months or years to build was suddenly frozen in place. In that moment, the people realized that their ambitious plan had reached an unavoidable end, not through natural disaster or human rebellion, but through a divine act that reshaped the way humanity would interact forever. As confusion deepened, the great construction effort slowly dissolved. Groups that could still communicate among themselves began to separate from the larger population. These divisions were not organized migrations at first. They were practical responses to a new reality. People naturally sought companionship with those whose speech they could understand. Families clustered together. Small tribes formed around shared language. Over time, these groups began leaving the city that had once symbolized human unity. The project that was meant to prevent scattering across the earth ironically became the very reason it happened. The people had declared earlier that they wanted to build the tower so they would not be dispersed across the world. Yet through the confusion of their speech, God ensured that dispersion would occur. Communities departed from the unfinished city in different directions, carrying their newly formed languages and cultures with them. As they traveled, these groups established settlements in distant regions, eventually becoming the early foundations of many nations and civilizations. What had begun as a single unified population gradually spread across the earth in accordance with God's earlier command that humanity should fill the world. The abandoned tower remained behind as a silent monument to the ambition that had once driven humanity to challenge the limits of heaven. The scriptures record that, because of this event, the place where the tower stood received a new name, Babel. The name itself carried deep meaning. It was associated with confusion, reflecting the dramatic transformation that had taken place there. In the narrative preserved in the book of Genesis, the city became a symbol of the moment when human unity was broken through the diversification of language. The story explains that it was at Babel that the Lord confused the speech of the entire world and from there scattered people across the face of the earth. Over generations, the memory of this event would remain embedded in the cultural traditions of the region. Later civilizations that rose in the same area would build impressive cities and towers of their own, yet the shadow of Babel lingered as a reminder of humanity's limits. The unfinished tower stood as evidence of a turning point in human history, a moment when pride met divine authority. For the people who left that place, the experience must have been both bewildering and transformative. They had witnessed their shared language dissolve into countless forms of speech, altering not only their communication but the very structure of society. From that moment forward, the world would never again be united under a single human language. The scattering of humanity after the events at Babel reshaped the development of civilization in profound ways. As communities migrated away from the plains of Shinar, They carried with them fragments of shared history, along with the new languages that had emerged during the confusion. These migrating groups spread across valleys, mountains, and coastlines, adapting to new environments and gradually developing distinct cultures. Over time, these divisions gave rise to the diversity of peoples and nations described later in the biblical narrative. Each group interpreted the world through its own traditions, shaped partly by geography and partly by the unique language that defined its identity. Language became more than a method of communication. It became the foundation of culture, storytelling, and collective memory. In this way, the event at Babel explains not only the origin of linguistic diversity, but also the fragmentation of humanity into separate civilizations. What had once been a unified human society was now a mosaic of cultures spread across the globe. The tower that had been intended to unify humanity instead marked the beginning of a world defined by diversity, distance, and cultural boundaries. Yet beyond the historical and cultural consequences, the story of the tower carries a deeper moral and theological meaning. Humanity's desire to build a structure that reached toward heaven was not condemned simply because of architectural ambition. Rather, it was the motivation behind the project that revealed a deeper problem. The builders openly declared their intention to make a name for themselves and to establish their own lasting legacy apart from divine authority. Their unity, while impressive, had become centered on pride rather than reverence. In the biblical worldview, unity without humility can become dangerous. When human cooperation is directed towards self-glorification, it risks leading society away from the values that sustain moral and spiritual balance. The narrative, therefore, presents the confusion of language not merely as punishment, but as a form of restraint. By dividing humanity into smaller groups with different languages, God limited the capacity for collective arrogance on a global scale. The fragmentation introduced boundaries that slowed the concentration of power and ambition. Through this intervention, the story suggests that human progress must remain balanced by humility before God. Without that humility, even the most impressive achievements can become instruments of pride that ultimately collapse under their own weight. Centuries after the events at Babel, the story would continue to resonate throughout the traditions of the ancient world. Scholars, theologians, and storytellers would reflect on its meaning, recognizing it as one of the earliest explanations for the diversity of languages and cultures across humanity. The narrative also stands as a meditation on the relationship between human potential and divine authority. Humanity possesses extraordinary creativity and the ability to cooperate in remarkable ways. The builders of the tower demonstrated that when people unite around a shared goal, they can achieve feats that once seemed impossible. Yet the story reminds us that technological progress and ambition alone do not guarantee wisdom. Without humility and reverence for something greater than ourselves, human achievements can drift into dangerous territory. The unfinished tower at Babel remains one of the most enduring symbols in the biblical narrative, a monument not of completed glory, but of interrupted pride. It marks the moment when humanity attempted to ascend toward heaven through its own effort and discovered instead the limits of human power. To fully understand the significance of the tower, one must place the event within the broader narrative recorded in the book of Genesis. The story unfolds only a few generations after the survival of humanity through the great catastrophe known as the Great Flood, biblical. After the flood, God had given humanity a clear directive through Noah and his descendants. They were to multiply and spread across the earth, filling it with life. This command was not merely practical, it reflected a divine vision for a world populated by diverse communities living across many lands. Yet the builders who gathered in the plains of Shinar chose a different path. Instead of spreading outward, they attempted to consolidate their power in one place. Their desire to build a city and tower was motivated partly by fear of being scattered and losing their unity. Ironically, their attempt to resist dispersion directly opposed the earlier command given after the flood. The tower, therefore, represents more than human pride. It represents a conscious decision to redefine humanity's direction apart from divine instruction. By attempting to establish their own centralized legacy, the builders were symbolically declaring independence from the purpose God had set for them. The confusion of languages that followed was therefore not random. It redirected humanity back toward the path originally intended, one where people would spread across the earth, forming diverse societies rather than a single unified empire built on pride. Archaeologists and historians have often compared the description of the tower to the massive, stepped structures known as ziggurats that later appeared throughout ancient Mesopotamia. These towering temples were designed to rise high above the surrounding cities, symbolizing a connection between heaven and earth. Although the biblical account does not describe the tower's exact shape, the cultural context of the region suggests that the builders may have envisioned something similar, a monumental structure rising in layers toward the sky. The land of Shinar, located in what later became a center of powerful civilizations, was known for such architectural ambitions. The tower described in the narrative would have required enormous labor, organization, and resources. Thousands of bricks would have been baked in large kilns, and teams of workers would have transported them upward as the structure grew taller. This level of construction implies a society already developing sophisticated planning and leadership. The builders were not primitive wanderers. They were innovators experimenting with urban life, engineering, and large-scale collaboration. Yet the story suggests that technological advancement alone does not determine moral wisdom. Even as humanity demonstrated remarkable creativity in shaping the world around them, their motivations revealed an underlying tension between human aspiration and humility before God. The name of the city, Babel, would echo through centuries of history and theology. In later generations, the region would become associated with powerful kingdoms and great cities, including the famous city known as Babylon. Although the biblical narrative about Babel predates those later empires, the name itself came to symbolize human pride, ambition, and the dangers of power concentrated without reverence for God. In the narrative from the book of Genesis, Babel represents the moment when human cooperation turned inward towards self-glorification. Instead of seeking to honor the Creator, the builders aimed to immortalize themselves. The phrase, "let us make a name for ourselves," reveals a universal human desire, the longing to be remembered, to leave a mark upon history. There is nothing inherently wrong with seeking accomplishment. Yet the story warns that when recognition becomes the primary goal, it can distort priorities. The tower was not built to serve others or to honor God. It was constructed to elevate human reputation. In that sense, Babel becomes more than a geographical location. It becomes a symbol of the human tendency to measure success by fame and influence, rather than humility and obedience. From a broader perspective, the story of the tower also reflects on the power of language itself. Before the confusion, the entire human population shared a single language, allowing ideas to move quickly and efficiently across the community. This shared speech enabled large-scale cooperation that made the tower possible in the first place. When God disrupted that unity by introducing multiple languages, the immediate effect was confusion. But over time, this division also produced creativity and cultural diversity. Each group that left Babel developed its own traditions, stories, and expressions. Languages evolved into unique systems of thought that shaped how communities understood the world around them. What began as an act of divine intervention eventually became the foundation for humanity's rich cultural tapestry. The world's countless languages today reflect that ancient moment when a single voice fragmented into many. In this sense, the event at Babel not only explains a historical shift, but also illustrates how limitation can lead to diversity. Humanity lost the simplicity of one shared language, but gained a world filled with varied cultures, identities, and perspectives. For readers and listeners throughout history, the Tower of Babel has served as a powerful reminder about the nature of human ambition. The builders believed they could ascend toward heaven through determination and unity alone. Their project embodied the belief that humanity, when organized and motivated, could overcome any boundary. Yet the narrative reminds us that not all limits exist merely to be broken. Some boundaries define the relationship between the human and the divine. The story does not condemn innovation, cooperation, or progress. Instead, it warns against the mindset that elevates human power above humility before God. The unfinished tower standing in the plains of Shinar becomes a visual metaphor for this lesson. It represents a moment when humanity reached upward in pride but was reminded of its limitations. The builders had imagined a monument that would reach the heavens, but what remained was an incomplete structure, a silent witness to the tension between aspiration and humility. Today, the story of the tower continues to be told as one of the most memorable narratives in the Bible. Recorded in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, it bridges the world after the flood with the later emergence of nations and cultures. The account explains why humanity speaks many languages and lives in diverse societies spread across the globe. But beyond that explanation lies a timeless reflection on human nature itself. The people who gathered at Babel were not villains in the ordinary sense. They were ambitious, creative, and united, qualities that often drive progress. Yet their story reminds us that even admirable traits can become dangerous when guided by pride rather than wisdom. The tower they built was meant to reach heaven, but instead it revealed a deeper truth. Humanity's greatest achievements must remain grounded in humility. In the end, the legacy of Babel was not a completed tower piercing the sky, but a transformed world, one filled with many languages, many cultures, and a lasting reminder that true greatness does not come from reaching heaven by our own strength, but from recognizing the authority of the one who created both heaven and earth. This is the abyss of the Scripture Channel. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more videos like this one. Thank you for watching.